Sugeeshwara Senadeera, Director International Media, who was formerly a diplomat turned researcher and then a media personality as well, with a lot of experience in terms of international relations. Good to have you here with us, Mr. Senadeera. Good morning.
Happy to be here. Morning.
And today we're going to talk about foreign policy of Sri Lanka. So since we focus mainly on the general public, we'll touch on Sri Lanka's foreign policy, the history of it, and about the current policy in a nutshell, in a layman's point of view.
Well, since independence, first decade after independence, we followed the British foreign policy until 1956. That has prevented us from even getting into to the United Nations in the first few years, because we were considered as a British, more or less a British colony initially, and Russia vetoed against us. But subsequently in 1954, they withdrew the veto against us, and we got into the United Nations. And after 1956, so-called revolution in politics in Sri Lanka, the Bandaranaike regime followed the non-aligned policy, although it wasn't called non-aligned at that time. But subsequently in 1962, a non-aligned was properly formed based on the Bandung Conference of 1954 and the subsequent conference tripartite conference between Egypt President then Ms. Nasser and Jawaharlal Nehru of India and Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia. They formed the non-aligned movement together with Nkrumah of Ghana. And the non-aligned movement, 1962, we became one of the pioneers under Mrs. Bandaranaike's leadership. Sri Lanka not only joined the movement, became one of the think tanks of the movement, the core of the non-aligned movement. That showed because 1962, when India and China border war erupted, Sri Lanka could intervene as a non-aligned nation's representative. Mrs. Bandaranaike visited Delhi and Beijing to settle the issue and brought a ceasefire between India and China. So that shows our strength at that time. Going back to another point in that time, United Nations also we were elected to the United Nations Security Council at that time. Sir Claude Correa, our permanent representative in New York, was elected as the president of the United Nations for that period, 62-63. So the high stature we enjoyed at that time was that. But unfortunately, things started declining since then. And after that, we couldn't get into the United Nations Security Council after that, because 1995 there was another chance, but South Korea and Sri Lanka vied for the Asian seat, and we decided to withdraw, or rather we decided to sell our withdraw on the condition that South Korea would give us grants and employment opportunities for youth, because economy was the priority at that time. The government decided to withdraw from that. So we lost our international prestige position like that. Subsequently, however, non-aligned thing continued. The policy continued until 1977. Then during Jayawardena government, there was a tilt towards the West, and he was called Yankee Dickey those days, Yunus Research Jayawardena. That antagonized India, because that time India didn't want to have anything to do with the United States, because they were close ally of Russia and the Warsaw Pact nations. So because of that, we had to suffer many things because of India's antagonism. But later, India too developed relations with the West as well as Israel. Israel set up, when we set up the Israel interest section in the US Embassy during Jayawardena's regime, we were accused of becoming a puppet of the Western Bloc. But finally, India also established diplomatic relations with Israel, so things worked out. Now, after this government came to power, we are a strictly neutral nation. We consider every nation as a friendly nation towards us, and we continue the non-aligned policy.
So that's the history of Sri Lankan foreign policy in a nutshell. Obviously, we do have a very long history, and you spoke of where we stand currently is that we consider every nation as our friend. So let's touch on bilateral relations, Senadeera.
Well, bilaterally, again, bilateral as well as multilateral forums like United Nations or Commonwealth, SAARC and ASEAN. ASEAN, we are an observer nation. So they are, as well as bilaterally, we continue very close relations. And as you all know, in this world where the regional powers as well as global powers vie for the top position, we have to maintain a rigid balance. I think we are doing it very well, maintaining the balance between. See, when we get economic assistance, we have to be very careful. There are no strings attached. And furthermore, we have to understand the geopolitical realities that whatever we said and done, India is our neighbor, the biggest regional power, and we have to maintain very cordial relations with India. Same time, China is our biggest economic supporter. So we have to have a very cordial cooperation with China too, without antagonizing each other. So we are continuing with quite satisfactory, I must say.
So that's in terms of bilateral relations. Now, since you did touch on our neighboring country, I thought of highlighting this, which was published in an editorial recently. Message and refusal to vote for Western nation. And Sri Lanka votes for India and Kenya at UNSC, but not for Canada, Norway, or Ireland. Can you elaborate on this, please?
United Nations Security Council, as you all know, have 15 members, of which there are 5 permanent members, 5 powers, Russia, US, Britain, France, and China. In addition to that, there are 10 other members. They change, 5 of them change periodically, representing different regions. Now, this time when the vote came earlier last month, when the vote team came at the United Nations General Assembly for the Security Council, 5 members, Asian contestant was India, and we, without any hesitation, we voted for India. And the African, there were 2 countries. We decided to vote for Kenya. There was no problem there. But when it comes to the Western representative, Western in the sense is the Western group is a heavy group. Even Australia is in the Western group, as well as North American, USA and Canada. To represent all of them, there were 3 contestants, Ireland, Norway, and Ireland, Norway and Canada. But we decided not to vote for any of them. The reason for that is we are really highly concerned and upset about the continuous Western attitude towards us. They have to recalibrate their position at the United Nations Human Rights Commission or at the United Nations other institutions. Because the last phase of the war in Sri Lanka, or the conflict in Sri Lanka, was over in 2009. Now 11 years have passed, but they continue to bring up certain issues that are not even relevant today. You see, what is essential is to bring up uplift the living standards of the people in the North and East. That government is doing its best. Even the people in the North and East are not interested in talking about human rights violations, so-called alleged human rights violations or such issues. They want a development assistance, which we are continuing as a government For the last so many years, we have done that. And the Western countries also, our biggest donors also must realize the need for uplifting the living standards of those people rather than using human rights as a political tool. So to express our anger or our dissatisfaction about the Western attitude, we have decided not to vote for any of them. Norway finally got elected, but we decided not to vote for Norway, though we have excellent relations bilaterally with those countries, Ireland, Norway, as well as Canada. We get development assistance, Canadian assistance, and CEDA is quite helpful to Sri Lanka. But
exactly.
Still,
so I was just about to ask if this would affect the relations we have with the Western nation.
No, I think this is a signal for them to rethink, recalibrate, and reevaluate our mutual relationship.
And where we stand.
Yes, and go forward in a positive manner.
And let's touch on the multilateral relations we have now that we spoke on bilateral relations. We'll touch on where we stand in terms of multilateral relations.
We take up the first, the SAARC as the first and immediate institution of multilateral bodies, because it's our regional and we are one of the equal partners of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. But unfortunately, because of the bilateral relations between India and Pakistan, the SAARC summit has not been held for last 4 years. And the SAARC, certain non-political activities like cooperation in archaeology, tourism, education, those are continuing. But unfortunately, because of the political will is necessary to carry out certain large cooperation programs envisaged for this decades under the Millennium Development Goals as well as Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. For these, there are the two areas in which SAARC cooperation is essential. So we insist on early summit. Despite they can leave aside their differences and look at the areas of commonalities and go forward and have the summit, because this time the summit will have to be held in Islamabad and India is reluctant to participate. That's the main problem. Other areas, other multilateral bodies, United Nations, we have excellent cooperation. Even at the United Nations Human Rights Commission, when we decided to withdraw from the proposal which we co-sponsored in the 2015 proposal together with the United States and several other countries. And we decided to withdraw from that proposal because we find it's not in line with the constitution of Sri Lanka, the legal system of Sri Lanka. Under our legal system, there is no provision for the international judges to probe issues in Sri Lanka. And our judiciary is quite independent and they are capable of handling this issue. Then the other issues such as setting up several bodies to implement the proposal of United Nations Human Rights Commission. To set up those institutions, there's no constitutional provisions in Sri Lanka. So we can't violate the constitution. Because of these grounds, we decided to withdraw. Furthermore, the UNHR's resolution was not approved by the Sri Lankan cabinet or the parliament. So it has gone without the cabinet approval and parliamentary approval. As a representative body of the nation, the parliament should have been informed in 2015. That was not done. So we decided to withdraw from that. Foreign Relations Minister Dinesh Gunawardena, when he announced in March the withdrawal from the UNHRC resolution, he said at the same time we will continue to work with the United Nations because we have so many cooperation areas of cooperation with the United Nations and the member countries of the UN. So there's no question of withdrawing from the United Nations. We are continuing to be one of the members of the United Nations, and we understand our obligations under the UN Charter, and we will continue to implement them.
So, since we did touch on bilateral and multilateral relations and about the foreign policy of Sri Lanka in a nutshell, I think we need to touch on tourism and about the recent incidents which had happened in our country too. And we continue with our morning show, and we've been talking about foreign policy of Sri Lanka and about the bilateral relations, multilateral relations. And now that we touched on where we stand in terms of bilateral and multilateral relations with different countries and organizations, let's touch on how Easter attacks, the recent incidents, has affected our international relations as well. Mr. Senadeera, because I think we are a country which counts on tourism, and we have a lot of people coming in because this certainly is a haven. So right now we did just come out of the issue where we had people fearing to come into our country because of the Easter attacks. So let's talk about how it has affected our international relations as well.
Well, April 21st attack didn't have a major
impact.
There was an impact, but there was no reason for change of foreign policy basics, because that was something different at all. It was a terrorist attack, but it has hit tourism very badly, not on tourism, the whole economic activities. And furthermore, the recent COVID attack accelerated the whole thing. Now, the economy, I think it will take quite some time, not only Sri Lanka's economy, but it has affected very badly the economies of even the powers like China and United States, United Kingdom, and France.
I think China's has dropped drastically in decades, I guess.
That's right. Even our neighboring rising economic power, India, too, is suffering. So all this will have an impact on Sri Lanka's economy, and recovery will be very slow. But fortunately, containing and controlling the COVID-19, we have succeeded in far better than most of the other developing countries in the world. And our fatality rate is quite low. It's just 11 or 12. And our recovery rate is very high. Furthermore, it has not spread in the society as such. Now it
what
has
we
been
see imported cases, if I'm not mistaken, mainly.
That's right. And those who directly coped up with the issue and they had to test and deal with the foreign arrivals, and the Navy personnel were exposed to that, few Navy personnels, and it has affected the armed forces. Apart from the Navy and the foreign arrivals, as you said, there's no spread in the social aspect at all. So that is the tremendous advantage we have. That's why we could reopen the economic activities and the governing activities immediately. Now, within 3 months, we managed to do that in a phased manner, and schools are to be reopened. So that's a quite successful story, and we do get assistance from the world because of our close cooperation and friendship with the other countries. So we received assistance, United Nations. United States has given us a lot of assistance. Recently also, U.S. ambassador has donated quite a lot of medical equipment, masks and so on. And China came up, and India too is sending us medicine and other equipment and requirements. So that way we are quite happy about our foreign relations. I must say that even at these troubled times, they come forth. Though they are also equally hit or badly, worstly hit, but still they come forward and assist us. And that also depicts Sri Lanka's excellent relations with the world.
And as you very correctly mentioned, although COVID-19 has hit globally and we are getting assistance from different Western countries as well, it's a country and a neighboring country as well, how do we intend to take this forward in terms of tourism now? Because you mentioned about a success story of Sri Lanka where the fatality rate is very less. And although we have a lot of imported cases in the country and many have recovered, and the fatality rate is lower than certain countries. So how do we intend to promote ourselves just to get the tourism industry booming again?
That's a very tricky area. You see, we need tourists to come, and now earlier we decided to open up our airports on August 2nd, but subsequently, because we have detected quite a few cases of COVID-19 among those who came from different countries in the last few weeks, now there are the second thoughts about reopening so soon, because we have to protect our people first. Though the tourism sector is vital for economy, but at the same time we can't afford to have a second attack of COVID-19 in the country. So we have to tread very, very carefully on this path, and taking into health guidance and the situations abroad, and the tourists originate from different countries. The COVID situation in those countries will have to be taken into consideration and take this decision. But gradually, I'm sure we'll be able to pick up. It might take 6 months or so to normalize the situation. But by next season, hopefully everything should be all right.
And finally, Sugeeshwara Senadeera, let's touch on the current foreign policy of Sri Lanka. Where do we stand right now?
Current foreign policy, as I said earlier, strict neutrality, non-alignment, and friendship to all. And at the same time, the message is no undue interference is allowed. For example, let us take Millennium Cooperation Compact Agreement. MCC agreement, I'll give a brief analysis on that. This originally came, after MCC was set up, they selected few countries as potential recipients of MCC assistance. And Sri Lanka was not in the original one. In 2004, they included Sri Lanka as one of the potential recipients and informed Colombo. And after the change of government in 2005, or rather change of presidency in 2005, President Mahinda Rajapaksa decided not to go for MCC, and he did not send any favorable response to the MCC offer in 2008. Then 2015, the proposal came up again. In 2015, September, there was a meeting in New York when President Maithripala Sirisena visited New York for the United Nations General Assembly. I was also in that delegation, and we had a discussion with the top MCC team. Even then, President Sirisena emphatically said that we have to study this carefully and take a decision. But subsequently, MCC decided to deal with the then Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. So the dealings were done directly, and it was subsequently 2017 an agreement was signed for preliminary surveys and feasibility studies. In those two areas, they offered us assistance. And MCC office was set up in the then Prime Minister's office, Temple Trees. In 2018, another agreement was signed to increase the original offer for feasibility studies. That was 7.4 million US dollars. It was increased by another 2.6 million US dollars and made it 10 million US dollars. But there's no documents in the finance ministry, that is external resources department of the finance ministry, which monitors all the revenue coming into the country as assistance, grants or loans from abroad. They have not been intimated about this, so nobody knows whether the money was offered to the government of Sri Lanka or not. So in that, the President Maithripala Sirisena instructed the Finance Minister Mangala Samaraweera not to sign the agreement in 2019. It was proposed to sign in 2019. So it was withheld. Then subsequently, it came up again, and the government has appointed Professor Gunaruwan and 4 others to examine the issue and come up with their recommendations. So they clearly say that certain areas in this agreement are not in line with our constitution. So furthermore, Attorney General has been barred from taking up any legal activities about MCC. In that MCC agreement also says, so that is against our legal system. So these kind of clauses will have to be removed if it has to be implemented. Sri Lanka will not sign it blindly. I'm sure they can have renegotiation and withdraw those detrimental clauses if they want to sign. So similarly, that shows our foreign policy. See, we are ready to cooperate. We are ready, even the aid and grants, we are not ready to blindly accept. We have to examine. So the foreign policy is we have cooperation with the world and in the region. So immediately after President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected, he visited India within a week. And thereafter, he planned 2 other visits, one to Beijing and one to Islamabad. But it could not be followed up due to the pandemic. Coronavirus came in February, so these were deferred. But that shows again that how we are very keen to have this balance between the powers and also our neighbors. And we have, Delhi is our neighbor, friend and relation, as President Mahinda Rajapaksa said. Similarly, Beijing is our major economic partner, and Pakistan has assisted us during when we are really in trouble, when we wanted arms. They didn't even ask for money. They just gave us arms on loans or grants. So these kind of friendships we cannot forget. So we maintain quite a strong relationship with all the countries.
With that, it's time for us to conclude this discussion as well. Thank you so much, Sugeeshwara Senadeera, for being a part of the show and for enlightening us about foreign policy of Sri Lanka in a nutshell, and talking about the bilateral and multilateral relations we have currently and what we intend to do in the future as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Indeed, a pleasure to be with you and happy about the discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. And we've been talking to Director, International Media, Sugeeshwara Senadeera, a former diplomat, researcher, and also a media personality.